Good morning. My name is Robin Wright. I'm a joint fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I want to welcome you all to the third in our series on the Iran Forum. We're meeting at a make or break moment with the deadline now only 12 days away. And there are stories this morning out of Vienna that Secretary of State Kerry is due in Vienna very soon, along with the foreign ministers of the other P5+1 countries. So this is a series that is unprecedented in Washington. We have formed a coalition of 8 think tanks to provide perspective on the different issues involved in a nuclear deal. The first one, which Joe Cirincione was a member, looked at the issues of what does a nuclear deal look like. The second looked at what the Iranians have to do. This morning, we're looking at the third and final piece of this puzzle, and that is what the U.S. has to cede in a nuclear deal to make it work. The 8 think tanks include the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Stimson Center, the RAND Corporation, the Arms Control Association, the Center for New American Security, Ploughshares, and Partnership for a Secure America. I'm honored to be joined this morning by 3 real experts on the subject of sanctions. To my left is Suzanne Maloney, who's a senior fellow at the Saban Center at the Brookings Institution, very well-known expert on Iran in this town. She's a former member of the State Department's policy planning staff and has covered all the key issues in the region, but particularly on the political economy of Iran. Before joining both the U.S. government and the Brookings Institution, she was a senior Middle East advisor to ExxonMobil. Ken Katzman is a senior Middle East analyst at Congressional Research Service with a special focus on the Middle East and South Asia. He reports to and briefs members of Congress and their staffs on U.S. policy. His publications include The Warriors of Islam, Iran's Revolutionary Guards. Liz Rosenberg is a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. She's also director of its Energy, Environment, and Security Program. She served from 2009 until 2013 as a senior advisor at the Department of the Treasury on issues of terrorism financing and financial crimes. So, just as a brief rundown, we had a couple of slides to show you to give you some perspective, and we've included it in a fact sheet we've put on every one of your chairs. There's a fact sheet as well as a flyer on the Iran Primer, which is today the most comprehensive website in the world on Iran, both from U.S. perspective and from covering Iranian issues, and the full bios of each of our speakers. But one of the kind of basics that everyone should know is as we deal with the issue of sanctions, there have been 16 executive orders and 10 congressional laws that have imposed sanctions on Iran. Sanctions have had a crippling effect on Iran's economy. First sanctions imposed in 2006, but it's really since 2012 where they've had an impact. And we've picked just 3 issues to reflect the scope of the impact. Oil revenues down 60%, currency has plummeted 60%, and it's cost Iran an estimated $100 billion since 2011. So we want to do this as a Q&A format, make this comfortable for all of us. I'm going to ask one opening question to each one, follow up, but then I want to open it up to you in the audience to get your participation to address the issues that are of interest to you. So we begin with Suzanne, the very basic question of what impact have sanctions had? What do the Iranians want as sanctions relief in a nuclear deal? How much is the United States actually willing to cede? And how can the differences be reconciled? So why don't we start with Suzanne, and if you could give us an overview, that'd be great.
I will do my best. Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you very much to U.S. Institute of Peace and to the other co-sponsoring organizations for putting together not just this panel with a couple of experts and a moderator whose experience on Iran far exceeds my own, but also the series that I think has really been a very nice package of issues that are really central to this whole question of what kind of a deal can we get. And as we are in the sort of wind down phase of the negotiations, I'm glad that we've got to the real question of the money, which obviously is crucial to why it is we are at this point today. We have had a system of sanctions, a regime of sanctions imposed on Iran to greater and lesser extents since November 1979, since the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran. But we've never seen the level of impact or the immediacy of American measures and the scope of multilateral cooperation with those measures and with imposition of separate measures by the international community. As we've seen over the course of the past 4 years, it's really been quite unprecedented and remarkable. It's probably led to some perhaps overly ambitious understandings of what sanctions can in fact achieve. But we know, as you've cited through some of these statistics, that the sanctions that have been imposed, particularly the financial measures that have begun to constrict Iran's ability to repatriate its oil revenues, to sell its oil abroad, as well as to deal just generally with the international financial community, have had a very significant impact on Iran's economy. They've contracted the economy quite significantly. They've led to all kinds of product shortages, to rising inflation, to increasing unemployment, to factory shutdowns. You name it, there has been direct evidence of these sanctions' impact on the pocketbooks of ordinary Iranians as well as on the government revenues. And that has been quite substantial and really, I think, an issue that there's very little debate about. The question of what the Iranians would like out of a deal, I think, is quite simple. What the Iranians want and what they need is the ability to do business with the world in something that approaches a normal fashion. As it is today, Iran's trade is restricted in many respects to barter trade and constricted to those countries with which it has significant oil revenue deposits because of this difficulty in repatriating the revenues. What Iran needs is to be able to transact its business with the rest of the world through the international financial system, the use of the SWIFT electronic payments mechanism, ability to access its resources that are in international banks around the world, and an ability to attract foreign investment and begin to see some sort of growth in its economy. All of these things are what the Iranians want. What they're likely to get is, I would imagine, quite significantly less than that. And I think we're going to have some discussion about what some of the specifics may look like over the course of this conversation. But I think what's likely is that any sanctions relief is going to be pegged to specific actions on the Iranians' part with respect to concessions on the nuclear program. So if and as Iran adheres to whatever commitments it may make in a deal, under those circumstances, sanctions relief will be accorded. So we've seen something like this over the course of the past 6 months negotiating period. As you're probably familiar, the interim agreement that was concluded last November included a number of measures for sanctions relief, including the release of a relatively modest amount of assets and some term-limited relief to particular sectors of the Iranian economy. We've seen those assets released take place if and only as Iran has reciprocated with its own commitments to specific measures on its nuclear infrastructure. And I think we're going to see something very similar with respect to any kind of a final deal. Every single element of the sanctions relief package will have to be pegged to fulfillment of commitments on the part of the Iranians. I think it's also quite clear that we're unlikely to see a significant change in the comprehensive embargo that applies to American businesses that has been in place really since the Clinton administration, because so many of the US sanctions have been applied for reasons that transcend just the nuclear issue and in fact in many cases predate it. The comprehensive embargo, I would imagine, under no circumstances would be released. And so we are likely to, in the best of all circumstances, and only over a gradual period of time, see some kind of a sanctions regime that is quite disproportionate between how it applies to American businesses and how it applies to international businesses. But that's only under the best of all possible circumstances, and I think it's quite clear that significant differences remain between the two sides at this time about what is possible to achieve in these negotiations.
Thank you. Ken, explain to us what the president would have to do in terms of dealing with executive orders, and then what Congress would have to do in dealing with legislation, the difference, the difficulty, and the time that it would take to do this, and maybe even touch on a little bit of the politics of what it would involve at a time of deep polarization in Washington.
Thank you very much, Robin. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. And I knew I was in Washington, D.C. when I saw this crowd to discuss Iran sanctions. First, I thought it was maybe a premiere of a Transformers movie or something like that. There's a few points I want to make about if there is a deal, how it would be implemented, what would be required, what would happen. Suzanne touched a little, what is Iran going to demand be lifted? My formulation is basically any sanction that was imposed after Resolution 1929 of June 2010. This was a date when sanctions ratcheted up dramatically in an effort to force Iran to the bargaining table, which arguably worked. So what does that mean? Basically, Iran is going to demand the lifting or the suspension, and we'll get into the difference, of U.S. secondary sanctions. In other words, U.S. sanctions that apply to foreign companies, foreign entities that are doing business with Iran. So as was mentioned, the locking up of Iran's oil revenues overseas, they're certainly going to demand that that be eased. The sanction from the fiscal year 2012 National Defense Authorization Act which has cut Iran's oil exports from 2.5 million barrels a day down to 1 million barrels a day. They're certainly going to demand that the ceiling on their oil exports be lifted. They're certainly going to demand that sanctions on their petrochemical industry, petrochemical products, equipment, metals be lifted. All of these were imposed after 2010, which gets me to my second point. The Joint Plan of Action, the interim agreement, stipulates that those sanctions would be lifted that are nuclear related. Well, what's a nuclear? All the U.S. sanctions, all the sanctions are incredibly interrelated. Most of the sanctions legislation have multiple titles which apply to Iran's use of terrorism and human rights and obviously the nuclear program, so it's incredibly difficult to separate nuclear-related from other sanctions. But the issue is, if you take my formulation and say those sanctions after 2010, then I think that makes sense, because Iran would demand that any sanction imposed for the purpose of getting Iran to the nuclear bargaining table must be lifted, and those are the ones that I stipulated. The ones earlier, such as investing in Iran's oil infrastructure, the U.S. trade ban, I think Iran is not likely to immediately demand that those be lifted, because those were imposed most primarily because of Iran's use of support for international terrorism, and particularly with regard to U.S. companies. My understanding is that the U.S. ban on trade would probably not be lifted until other issues with Iran are resolved, regional issues, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. So what does that mean? Let's say we get a deal. Basically, the president is likely to, I would say, basically suspend sanctions through waiver authority. Almost all of the sanctions laws, because of the constitutional separation of powers, give the president the ability to waive suspension of that law. He must certify that it's in the national interest to do so, and many of the laws stipulate other certification requirements, but still, the president can waive the application. Now, the issue is, can the president promise to waive them? In other words, these laws, the way these laws work, the president must determine that somebody has violated and then say, I'm waiving the law because it's in the national interest. The question is, as part of a deal, can an administration say, I am henceforth, no matter, before I investigate any specific violations, I am going to automatically be waiving the penalties? That's an issue that is very hotly debated right now, because the way the laws work, there has to be a determination and then a waiver. It's not supposed to work where the president just says, well, from henceforth, I'm going to waive automatically. That said, it has happened. It has happened. If you recall, there was a project in 1998 involving Total, Petronas, and Gazprom to develop South Pars gas field. That was determined to be sanctionable. The EU threatened to take the United States to the World Trade Organization and file a case. The United States and the EU settled it by saying, if the EU cooperates with the United States on Iranian terrorism and Iranian proliferation, all subsequent EU similar projects will be waived. So there is precedent for this automaticity of waiver. Now, to then get to the issue of down the road, obviously Iran is going to demand, well, okay, you keep waiving, and every 6 months, when do we get permanent relief? This is going to come up. So my view is basically, there'll be a period, let's say a year, let's say 2 years, Iran will comply. We'll have a deal. The International Atomic Energy Agency will certify, yes, Iran is meeting its commitments under the deal. And maybe a year or two, Iran will say, okay, we've been complying for a year or two. Why don't we need permanent sanctions relief? And then that's when the issue comes, the rubber meets the road of whether the Congress would at that point act to actually repeal any of these sanctions laws or rewrite them in such a way to give Iran permanent sanctions relief.
Great. So Liz, talk to us about both the reality and the psychology of sanctions relief. How would the international community respond to sanctions relief? Is this going to happen overnight? Is this something, after all these years of sanctions, that companies, corporations are likely to be a little bit cautious about? In other words, how quickly would this translate into a reality for Iran and actually make a difference?
Right. Well, thank you, Robin, and thanks to our USIP hosts. It's great to be part of this panel and this consortium of events. So the quick answer to your question is, the floodgates are not going to open immediately. Even under the best case deal scenario, there will not be an immediate collapse of the sanctions regime and pouring back into Iran of private business. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, let me offer a few thoughts about sanctions relief on paper and in practice. And the reason why I think this is important is because they're not the same thing. That distinction is really important. Iran is surely an incredibly attractive potential investment opportunity as an emerging market. There's 80 million people. It's a relatively young and well-educated population. There's a middle class with a desire for additional consumer goods from abroad. It has the 4th largest oil reserves, 2nd largest gas reserves. They are of a conventional nature. They're relatively inexpensive to produce. There's also historical trading ties with the Middle East and with Europe, elsewhere. It's an incredibly attractive opportunity, and Iran knows this. They've been courting potential investors from all over the world. We've seen them host a lot of trade delegations and go abroad to discuss potential opportunities and new contract formulations with investors elsewhere. And it's clear that with a good amount of sanctions relief, possibly what could be included in a deal, even if it's not as much as they would like, it could have quite a significant structural impact on their economy, being a real game changer for Iran, allowing the generation of revenue to make quite significant changes in their economic growth rate and a variety of other economic performance indicators. So there's a potential windfall there, and there's a lot of investor enthusiasm. But there's also a lot of caution on the part of international companies and the international private sector about going into Iran. And this is because of concerns about continuing illicit activity in Iran and the maintenance of sanctions going forward, and also a very well-ingrained culture in the international private sector of sanctions compliance. So I'll go through 5 main reasons for investor concern that will slow down the potential investments they may make in Iran under a potential opening of sanctions or lifting of sanctions in a deal scenario. So first, there's a lot of uncertainty about whether a potential deal will hold and whether the Iranian regime will remain in power and continue to enforce it over the course of time. And that factor is one reason that has prevented more cheating. We haven't seen much cheating, it doesn't appear that way, during this 6-month period of the interim deal under the Joint Plan of Action. And this reason, this uncertainty about what the future will hold, will also mean that some of the first deals that occur in a potential Iran sanctions lifting scenario will be short-term. They will feature a short payback period so that companies know that they will be paid for their investments. A second reason, sanctions will still exist no matter what in a best case deal scenario, as has been alluded to by my fellow panelists. So not just nuclear sanctions, which would be, as the international negotiators, the P5+1 negotiators have indicated, relieved in stages over time. So those sanctions that would eventually be lifted as part of a deal, it will take time for them all to be lifted. They won't happen all on the first day. And also sanctions imposed for terrorism, human rights violations, regional destabilization, those will stay in place no matter what. They're not part of the terms of the deal. And those apply to companies, financial institutions, agencies of the Iranian government. Negotiating those sanctions still in place will be a due diligence challenge for any potential investors in Iran. The third reason is that violating sanctions is expensive, and it's very damaging to the reputation of international companies. So late last month, we saw French bank BNP agree to pay $9 billion for sanctions violations and agree to cease US dollar clearing activities for a period of time. That's a very substantial and painful penalty for violating sanctions, and that follows on penalties, $1.9 billion that HSBC agreed to pay in 2012, Standard Chartered Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, and others. And even during this interim period, this 6-month interim period, we've seen the Treasury Department impose sanctions for, impose penalties and name cheaters for sanctions violations. So we know that even while negotiators are moving towards a potential deal, there's still an interest and a commitment to enforcing sanctions on the books. Another reason for investor caution is that Iran presents a challenging business environment. Corruption is well documented and widespread. Iran will need to make changes to its investment regime, its regulatory regime, in order to, the contracts that it offers, in order to be quite hospitable to international investors. Relationships need to be rebuilt. They are fresher for some European and Asian companies, but there's still a need to prospect opportunities and reestablish business ties. And that's something, of course, that's been going on during all of these trade missions to Iran and the visiting of potential business counterparts. And finally, Congress could undermine a potential deal, of course, whether that be by rejecting a deal that the P5+1 in Iran do come to, or by imposing new sanctions not related to the nuclear concerns, so for example related to Iran's support for terrorism, as a nuclear deal is beginning. Iran is unlikely to distinguish between the economic pain imposed by nuclear sanctions or terrorism-related sanctions. I think they will see any imposition of new sanctions as an act of ill will or ill faith on the part of the P5+1 and an attempt to sabotage the potential for a deal. So at a minimum, the private sector would need to respond to that with increased attention, due diligence to navigate a new landscape constructed by more actors than they may have thought, more actors than just those negotiating in the P5+1 in Iran. for engaging in business in Iran. And another final point that that creates caution and concern for potential investors looking towards business opportunities in Iran is that they're hoping to see a coordinated multilateral lifting of sanctions, whether that's a small amount or a large amount. It really matters that there is a harmonization, an attempt towards harmonization made internationally. There's a couple of main reasons for this, and they involve the fact that, for example, if a European company sees that Europe has, this is a hypothetical scenario, but lifted sanctions on doing oil business with Iran, including the shipping and insurance provisions that would need to go along with, and financial repatriation provisions that would need to go along with that, that company might face sanction under the U.S. sanctions. So if they have an interest in doing business in the United States or in the U.S. dollar, they face losing that business if they violate U.S. sanctions. In practice, I think most companies in Europe and Asia, elsewhere, that are interested in doing business in Iran also have an interest in doing business in the US dollar or in the US. So they will try not to violate US sanctions. If they don't have a big legal presence in the United States and they are sanctioned, they won't have ability for a legal recourse in the United States. Another major incentive towards acting to move into Iran when it hasn't been made permissible under a lifting of US sanctions. Just to end, a couple of final points. The first, I want to just reiterate, there won't be a flood of business into Iran on day one in a best case deal scenario and sanctions lifting scenario. It's going to take time, a greater degree of legal certainty, and I think a signal from the US Congress that it will at least tolerate a deal. And additionally, the P5+1, given all of these challenges I've just laid out, that have to do with engaging in new business in Iran, they'll need to be very careful in how much sanctions relief they promise. If they overpromise and the private sector underperforms, there's a real credibility problem for the P5+1. Iran will look at this scenario and think that the P5+1 is not doing its part to uphold its part of the deal. And the P5+1 will risk losing some leverage in future relations with Iran. Finally, I think there's quite a good chance that we'll see in a potential sanctions lifting scenario some legal guesswork done on the part of international companies, some overconfidence, overreach, recklessness, ignorance, and that will be met by the United States, in particular the US Treasury, with an effort to crack down on such instances of sanctions cheating as a way to show and to strongly signal to the private sector exactly which kinds of business are available under sanctions relief and which are not. So if there is a nuclear deal, if there is sanctions relief for Iran, we will still see quite a lot of, I think, aggressive enforcement of existing sanctions, which will have, again, a chilling effect on some of those that may look to enter Iran. It may cause them a bit of concern and slow them down a bit as they're planning their reentry.
Thank you very much, Liz. Let me ask Suzanne. There's been an allusion to it in each of your presentations about the issue of the phases of a deal. Now, when the United States talks about a deal, it talks in terms of a decade, a generation, that they want something that's in place over a long period of time. Can you address how sanctions might be might coincide with each stage? Are we talking about 20 years, 10 years, 20 years of lifting sanctions in a very gradual way? How realistic is that? And secondly, the kind of broader question. I was in Tehran, I've been in Iran twice in the last 6 months, and I've been struck by the fact sanctions have not had the impact it did during the Iran-Iraq War, when you because of rationing of meat and gasoline. You know, there were huge shortages of basic commodities. Today, Iran, you can find literally anything. I went to a Porsche dealership, and it was not the only one. And they sell a Porsche. I learned more about Porsches in Tehran than I did here. You can buy a Carrera 911S for $300,000, and they can't keep them in stock. I mean, there is there is money. At the same time, Ahmadinejad did such damage to the economy that when you consider that more than half of all the oil revenues Iran has made since oil was discovered were earned during Ahmadinejad, and he basically blew right through it. So there's this kind of disconnect. There's enormous wealth, but there's also a sense that mismanagement was as much a factor as sanctions, really. We like to think that sanction was the pivot, but in fact, it's this intersection of the two phenomena. So if you could address that, how vulnerable is Iran today economically, just in general, and then the issue of the phases and how that might work. We saw a little bit of it, but what time frame are we talking about?
Thank you. Those are two really interesting, wide open questions. I think the timeline will very much depend on what the overall timeline for the deal is. And we know that this is one of the sort of sleeper issues, potential bombshells within the deal. And it's been discussed in some of the prior iterations of these panels that USIP has helped to organize. There's a big difference between what the United States administration, as well as what the Congress might consider to be a tolerable sort of rehabilitation period for maintaining these very extensive constraints on Iran's nuclear activities and infrastructure, and what the Iranians are looking to get out of this deal with intact. So, I think the timeline for sanctions and the phasing of sanctions will be very much pegged to where the final decision comes out on this time frame. And I can't tell you I'm confident on where that's going to be. I think it's obviously going to be shorter than what some of the very extensive multi-decade time horizons have been suggested on our side, but it's also not going to be the sort of snap of the fingers that clearly many on the Iranian side are both demanding and anticipating. And I think this gets into this whole question of psychology and how this deal has been sold both within Iran as well as within the international community. This expectation, as Liz said, both cultivated by the Iranians, but also, I think, used on this side as an argument against diplomacy, that somehow business is going to rush back into Iran. It's really a double-edged sword for the Iranians because, as Liz suggested, it's really not proven to be the case over the course of this interim period. But it has set some very high expectations on the part of the Rouhani administration from the Iranian side and among the Iranian people, for whom the deal last November was really sort of the deal. They're not focused on numbers of centrifuges or particular installations. What they're focused on, and I know this from my own time on the ground now, quite dated within Iran, is on this ability to interact normally with the rest of the world. And this has been brought home to them in a very clear way, how restricted and how constrained they've been over the course, particularly, as has been said, of the past 4 years since 1929. And so I think that those expectations, those very expansive expectations for a peace dividend as a result of the sort of measures, the public diplomacy that we saw on the part of Rouhani when he came to New York. He published an op-ed in the Washington Post. He accepted the phone call from President Obama, perhaps solicited the phone call from President Obama. No one's ever quite clear about that. These were all breakthroughs from the Iranian perspective. And it came at a time when Iranians were beginning to see some improvement in the economy at home, because Rouhani was able to put back in place a number of technocrats who'd been forced out of the Iranian government by Ahmadinejad and the people around him. It's really ironic that the most constrictive period of international pressure on Iran came during the same period that oil revenues boomed. Despite the 2008 drop, Ahmadinejad's tenure, as well as the sort of whole time frame of the nuclear dispute and the revelations since 2002, coincided with this sort of epic boom. And as you said, more than half the oil revenues earned since 1908 by the Iranians, since the discovery and marketization of oil in Iran, were earned during the Ahmadinejad period. So there's a lot of cash in this economy. There's a lot of resources. And as Liz said, it's a well-educated population. It's got all the fundamentals for a sort of future takeoff. But that future takeoff is going to be delayed, has been delayed. And I think we're already starting to see a certain degree of frustration with Rouhani, with the international community, and it will break every way. There will be no beneficiary of it. For those who think that, in fact, intensifying the pressure is likely to lead to a better outcome, I think that remains considerably unclear. The issue of how do we create a stable horizon, stable expectations, I think is also quite difficult and something that needs to be contemplated as we construct this deal. First of all, we know the sanctions a heck of a lot better than the Iranians do. They've been very adept over the course of the past 35 years in managing under international pressure, whether it was the pressure of their own self-imposed retraction from the international economy after the revolution, whether it was the pressure of the war and the logistical constraints that were imposed on their trade with the rest of the world, or the various forms of US sanctions that have been put in place since '79. They know how to mitigate them, they know how to get around them, they know how to incredible smuggling networks. But they don't know the legalities, and they don't know the bureaucratic procedures, and they don't have any appreciation for how difficult and how time-consuming and how intricate the process is going to be, and how many ways the structure of that process can be used to slow investment, to slow their own return to the international economy. And I think that's one issue that we all need to be concerned about, because to the extent that it's leverage on our side, it also creates, as has been said, potential for imbalance. And as we know, there have been periods in Iranian history where the political elite has become frustrated with what they expected with after the 2003 and 2004 concessions on the part of the Iranians with respect to uranium enrichment. A decision was made less than 2 years later in 2005 to restart the enrichment program, precisely because they felt they hadn't gotten what they'd been promised from the Europeans at that time. And I think we don't want to set ourselves up for a scenario in which the Iranians, in part because of lack of understanding and lack of familiarity with the very intricate bureaucratic and legal processes around these sanctions, are likely to find themselves in 6 months to a year feeling as though they have been sold a bill of goods. It's not just problematic because it would undercut a deal. I think it's problematic because it would undercut US credibility and the credibility of the P5+1 in doing a deal in good faith. And I think that's going to be particularly important. As Ken said, there are ways in which sanctions waivers, ways in which the president can use his authority to create new opportunities to open the path without necessarily working through Congress directly. But much of that has to be done very, very carefully. And even if you look back to the waiver of Iran-Libya Sanctions Act that was written for Total back in 2000, it didn't actually give blanket authority to European companies to invest in the Iranian energy sector. It was constructed very carefully. And so while many interpret it as a sort of yellow light to go in, it still was a hindrance on investment in Iran. And I think that this is a really interesting moment in terms of how we move forward with the sanctions relief, both with respect to the Iranian political environment, but also with respect to how we use sanctions toward other adversarial countries and in other entrenched problems. Because it's not a spigot that you can turn off and on very easily. And we have found that the sort of reach and scope of American law, even to companies that have very limited access to the American market, is so severe, and the intimidation factor is so high right now that we may have a great deal of difficulty in actually encouraging the kind of investment we may want to see at some point in the future in Iran.
I think that's very true. Ken, on both of my trips, I saw the foreign minister, Javad Zarif, and talked about the issue of sanctions and lifting them and how you do it and so forth. And he made clear both times that Iran wants Congress to act, that it wants not just presidential waivers. It wants Congress to be a part of the process for fear that with a new president there would be just new sanctions imposed, or that you have to deal with the toughest nut to crack. And that means the political will on the Hill. They want something that says it's not just the White House behind that you have kind of the American people as well. So maybe you can talk to us for a little bit about, A, the mood on the Hill about sanctions relief, and you avoided my question the first time around about the polarization on the Hill, and how that might complicate the process of fulfilling what Iran wants out of a deal.
Well, let me answer it as I'm sort of allowed to. You know, it's, I mean, what I would say is, I would say Iran needs a deal. You know, I don't doubt that this Porsche deal is, you know, the IMF said their economy shrunk 6% in 2013. That is severe. Our economy here shrunk about, what, 4% in the 2008 crash, and it was dramatic. I mean, you know, unemployment went to 10% here. 6% is huge. It is huge. And now they need money because they're propping up Mr. Assad and they're propping up Mr. Maliki as well. So they need even more money. These things cost money. That's their foreign policy. That's their right to have their foreign policy the way they want. It costs money. So they need, I would say, sanctions relief. Now, we talked about the stepwise. I mean, to my mind, a lot of sanctions would have to be eased, suspended at once, because it doesn't, you can't, it's all interlocked. You can't allow them to export back to 2.6 million barrels a day, but the revenue is still locked up in foreign banks, and you can't allow that without allowing them to use the SWIFT system, because then they can't bring the money back to Iran. So all these, to my mind, all these would have to be lifted quickly. This is what the Iranians would demand. Now, you know, we can get to the issue of maybe allowing investment in Iran down the road. That could be maybe sequenced later, because it's not immediate. But, you know, again, dealing in precious metals, dealing in hard currency, shipping insurance, all of these, it seems to me, would need to be, as part of a deal, lifted very quickly in the process. Otherwise, it does Iran no good. In terms of Congress, you know, again, I'm in a CRS capacity here. To my mind, you know, Congress, I think, what they are looking for in this deal is, does it take the issue of an Iranian nuclear weapon off the table or not? If it does take it off the table, then I think Congress is more likely to, you know, if down the road Iran demands that Congress act, or they're going to abrogate the deal, then, you know, I think Congress might be more willing to look at that. If it doesn't completely take the idea of an Iranian nuclear weapon off the table, you know, then I think there's going to be skepticism. Now, you know, obviously I can't get into the politics of, you know, there was a proposal to have new sanctions that would go into effect after the interim agreement expired. Mr. Obama threatened to veto it, and it wasn't brought to a vote. I can't go any more than that. But, you know, this is a priority issue for the administration. A deal is a priority issue for the administration. Now, on the issue of waivers, though, to your point about what Zarif said, if there is a deal and waivers are issued to allow the United States to implement its commitments under this deal, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I would say that that is binding on the next president. There is not, under the way the Constitution works, a new president does not come in and say, I don't like the deal that Mr. Obama negotiated, and I'm not issuing these waivers because I don't like the deal. The system here does not work that way. Now, there have been international agreements, I think it was NAFTA, please somebody correct me, where a president can come into office and say, let's review the deal, or let's renegotiate certain aspects of the deal. That could happen. And then we'd have to go back with the Iranians and P5+1 and look at it if that were to happen. But the idea, I think, of a next president coming in and saying, I am not issuing these waivers, that would be viewed, I think, as an abrogation of the U.S. commitment, and I don't see it happening.
But he could issue new executive orders.
To do,
No?
I mean,
You know
to
the answer
do
to
what?
this?
Sure, a new president could issue any executive order
Yeah.
they want, but I was just going to cut
It's
it.
still-
I would respectfully disagree with the suggestion that a new president would be bound to use the same waivers in the same ways that that President Obama has used. But go ahead.
No, I mean, I just, well, we could disagree on it, that's fine. It's just because the deal would be viewed, not extending the waivers or issuing contradicting executive orders that would have the effect of basically abrogating the deal, I think would not fly. I just think it would not fly.
Go ahead, and then I have a separate question for you as well.
I think that a treaty, a formal treaty, I agree, would certainly bind the next president to the terms of a treaty, although, of course, a new president could revisit that and do what they would. But that I see as binding through continuation to a new administration. But with respect to the use of waivers and the way that they may be effectuated through a change in regulation or in licenses, I think that there's great discretion on the part of a next administration, a next president, to be able to make modifications if they don't want to. However, I certainly agree that if that happens, it would be seen as not in the spirit of the agreement made and the promises committed to in the context of a deal.
In which case Iran says, okay, we're abrogating, and the centrifuges get plugged back in. You know, it just doesn't.
The case in point is in fact ILSA. The fact that the Bush administration came in 2001 sort of debating and reviewing ILSA, but in fact, despite the fact that it supported the congressional reauthorization of ILSA, it also continued to uphold the sort of implicit agreement in the Total waiver that ILSA would not be aggressively enforced. And it was only, and took until the Obama administration came into office and the environment changed substantially on the Hill that we saw renewed pressure to, in fact, enforce ILSA. So I think once waivers are put in place, they have a certain degree of staying power, even if a president has some ability to alter them.
I want to open it up to your questions, but just one quick question to Liz. We've been running a list on the Iran primer of all the countries and all the delegations that have shown up in Iran, and one of the most ironic was from the French. The French who had, last November, when they were negotiating the final terms for the interim deal, threw in a new demand at the last minute to the surprise of the Americans and everybody else. And of course, the French were the first ones to send in a delegation of over 100 businessmen to Tehran to talk about deals in January. And so it's clear that the Europeans have, in some ways, more to gain short-term out of a deal than American businesses, and that the Iranians are in many ways looking to the Europeans. They've been buying a lot from Asia in the absence of, because of geography and bartering and their arrangements with Iran, with China on oil and so forth. But they're dare I say this, they're quite Western in their appetites, and really want, whether it's fashion or cars or appliances or whatever, they really like the Western goods better, and they'd like to do deals with the West more. And if they're not going to do them with the United States anytime soon, and Europe is this great market. So maybe you can talk to us just very briefly about what Europe might have to do to lift sanctions, and is this really where we're likely to see more movement? Do they have the same constraints that we do? And a lot of the sanctions they've imposed are similar to ours.
Yes, that's true, except theirs aren't extraterritorial. So it's true that Iran is very interested in engaging in deals with European or even American countries, although I certainly agree that that's not, U.S. companies will not be first movers into Iran for a variety of reasons we've discussed. And the reasons for that are because European companies, US companies have technological sophistication, they have project management experience that is incredibly attractive, they have real comparative advantages in those areas. So for example, in the energy sector, Iran, like many resource-endowed countries, energy resource-endowed countries, they would like to have European or American companies come and develop their energy resources because of that technical and project management experience and sophistication. So recently, when Iran kicked out CNPC for underperformance in its in oil field development, many people looked at that as an indication that, in fact, they are freeing up opportunities, hopefully, for European companies that they'd like to come in instead and do that oil field rehabilitation and expansion in the future. So France, to your point about France, they have been very interested and committed, of course, to the P5+1 process and instrumental in the EU's imposition of sanctions on Iran. However, they have sacrificed a lot to do this. Bank Tejrat, for example, its location in France, is one of the most recent to be sanctioned. That hurt for France. So did auto sector sanctions. That is a jobs issue in France. In particular, Total is one such company, French company, that has quite a lot of support from the French government that would be well placed to do business in Iran and has a history of work, of course, in the region. What it would take for Europe to lift sanctions. So their sanctions largely parallel sanctions the United States has in place, but for the reasons that I mentioned before about the need for coordinated multilateral lifting of sanctions, Europe will have a significant interest in working cooperatively with the United States to make sure that sanctions are lifted in a way that doesn't create major conflict of law problems for European companies. They are acutely aware that European companies will be entangled in U.S. sanctions if they move out ahead of where U.S. sanctions lifting those opportunities that U.S. sanctions liftings may create for international companies in Iran. So we've already discussed some of the most attractive opportunities or most attractive sectors in which Iran would like to see relief. Energy, autos, which by some counts as the second largest industry in Iran. Of course, the ability to move money, and the EU holds a very significant card when it comes to sanctions on Iran. The imposition that it has on use by Iranian banks of its SWIFT payment messaging system, and that is locked up under EU sanctions, not US sanctions.
Thank you. I want to open it up to your questions. If you'd identify yourself and your organization in the back, right up there. Wait for the mic.
Hi, I'm Wallace Hayes, independent energy consultant. My question is about, is there a distinction between waivers and licensing? Because on the Total issue and the ILSA investment issues, we had one waiver, and then there were half a dozen to a dozen other investments that were treated as if they were part of that same waiver but never actually got waivers. And so that's why they were able to go back and re-examine those issues in the Obama administration. So is there a difference? Do you have to issue waiver by waiver on every single transaction, or can you do something like issue a general license that allows, for example, for the lifting of Iranian crude? Thank you.
Liz, you want to take that?
Sure. So this may not satisfy you, but it may depend a little bit on what you call waiver and what you call, how you define license. And so, in general, using a waiver may not be enough to get business moving. You may need to, the way that it then takes effect to actually make companies see that there is an opportunity there is by changing regulation or issuing licenses. Those licenses can be general licenses, they can be specific licenses. For an individual transaction, that's probably a specific license or an individual waiver. And it, again, depends on the underlying sanctions authority that you're talking about, what kind of statute it's linked to, or other vehicle. If either of you want to speak to the specific example he mentioned.
Well, I mean, I would just say that reach-back authority and the extent to which we've seen sanctions enforcement take place retrospectively is one of the really major factors in the fear that has been, I think, entrenched now within the international financial community, within the international energy sector, and other key areas that the Iranians might be looking to tap as they begin to reopen their economy to the world. There are so many companies that look at whether it's BNP or Standard Chartered or any number of other firms that have been subject to significant penalties as a result of activities regarding Iran or that took place in Iran that stretch back several years. That is, I think, going to continue to deter companies from investing even after we see the regulations in place when and if there's a deal. It will take not just weeks, not just months, but years. And this is what will differentiate the Iranian case from other cases of sanctions, relaxation, or lifting. We've been through this before with respect to Iraq, with respect to Libya, and a couple of other cases in point. But none have been under this continued scrutiny. None have continued to have the scope of the sanctions that are likely to remain in place with respect to Iran.
I think that was true even of South Africa, that it took a long time, despite the kind of epic transition it underwent, to lift some of the sanctions that were imposed during the apartheid era. George.
Hi, George Lopez, Vice President here at USIP in the Academy. If I were thinking about that the U.S. would cede some things, one of the areas I'd look at is the UN Security Council resolutions. I was glad to hear Ken talk about the 1929 as a figure point there. But the Iranians could put the U.S. in a situation in which, if the IAEA verifies that things have been closed down in agreement with 1929 and 1984 resolutions, then you ask for a vote in the Security Council to ease those sanctions, which takes 140 entities and individuals off the list and any number of things, and you don't have to really worry about Congress, and you put the U.S. in what might be seen by some as a favorable position of bringing UN Security Council resolutions to a close, or the unfavorable situation of maybe vetoing the relaxation or suspension of those resolutions, where we've really negotiated the deal that the conditions for the original resolutions are met. So I'd like your observations on that, any of you on the panel. Thank you.
The resolutions would not in themselves be binding, let's say, on Congress. I mean, the resolutions are a mandate or an authority, particularly 1921, which was more of an authority than a mandate. Which give member states the authority to take certain steps. The Congress then, the Congress took certain steps on its own, and the administration signed these laws. So lifting the resolutions would not necessarily mean automatically that Congress would then be, mandated to act to repeal these sanctions. I just want to add on the licensing issue. The Iran Sanctions Act, when you talk about the United States administration doesn't license foreign companies. The U.S. government only licenses American companies. The U.S. government has no jurisdiction over foreign. So it wouldn't be a license. It would be a promise to, as was done in 1998, basically a pledge to waive penalties under the Iran Sanctions Act for deals like that under certain circumstances.
Yes.
Go
ahead, sure.
The 1929 issue, that I think that actually would be welcome in some quarters here in Washington, because 1929 is actually quite a bit more expansive than the interim agreement is in terms of what it requires. So I think, if anything, it actually imposes more on the Iranians and nets them less in terms of actual sanctions relief, because, as we all know, the brilliance of the UN Security Council resolution passed in 2010 was not so much in the specific entities or penalties that it imposed, but in the fact that it served as a platform for the European Union as well as for a number of other states around the world to implement their own unilateral sanctions on Iran using UN Security Council 1929 as a justification for those unilateral measures. So I don't see, in fact, that lifting of UN Security Council resolutions actually brings real relief to the Iranian economy, and it actually would probably revive or give more authority to some of the technical questions that have come up over the course of the negotiations, particularly the missile issue, if we were to, in fact, to revert to that as the basis for the negotiations rather than the joint plan of action.
Barbara?
Thanks very much. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Thank you for a really interesting discussion. I wanted to first brief advertisement. Ken, we have copies of your paper outside. Ken wrote a paper called Unwinding U.S. Sanctions on Iran for us at the Atlantic Council, and it's outside. And there was something in it, Ken, you didn't mention. I wondered if you would talk a little bit about it, and that is the impact of allowing the Iran Sanctions Act to sunset at the end of 2016. How much that would mean for the Iranians. Also, whether your definition of nuclear-related sanctions as being anything post-July 2010, is that widely accepted, or is that just your own formulation? Suzanne, others, do you know if that's also the way the U.S. government is looking at the sanctions issue? Thank you.
The way what I was trying to get at with this post-2010 is to say, a lot of the sanctions passed after that do not say anything about nuclear weapons or nuclear tech, the oil exports, shipping. To define a nuclear-related sanction narrowly as only any sanction that mentions nuclear weapons, nuclear equipment, the Iranians, that will not fly with the Iranians. The Iranian view, I think, is that any sanction that was imposed to compel Iran to a nuclear bargain is to them a nuclear-related sanction. So I was just trying to make that point. The Iran Sanctions Act, under current law, sunsets on December 31, 2016. So it is possible to hypothesize a situation where there is a deal, let's say this year, and there is, a year and a half or so of 2 years, more than 2 years of compliance. Let's say the Iranians comply in 2015, 2016, where the Iranians say, we now insist that the Iran Sanctions Act, which bans the investment in Iran's energy sector, we insist that it be allowed to sunset. Congress has to act to extend the sunset if they want to, which means President Obama could theoretically veto that legislation and insist that it sunset. So I was pointing that out as a possible mechanism, because the Iran Sanctions Act does trigger many different sanctions, particularly on the energy sector.
Can I,
sure.
Just speaking to the point about what is a nuclear sanction, yes, you could read it narrowly, what says nuclear material, et cetera. EO, the Executive Order 123A2 on proliferation activities is one that we classically think of as nuclear, but of course it's broader than just nuclear proliferation. If we think about a distinction from 1929 until the present, those sanctions that have been issued during a period of greatest international concern about Iran's nuclear activities, you could call that nuclear, and certainly there have been great pains made by those in the P5+1 to draw a connection between the economic sectors that have been sanctioned and Iran's nuclear ambitions, in that revenue from these sectors enrich the regime's ability to pursue its proliferation activities and there have been nuclear-related or proliferation-related transactions intermingled or disguised in transactions in these other sectors. However, to my mind, what's less important, that how exactly you read what nuclear is less important than the flexibility that it affords to P5+1 negotiators. And in fact, they have declined when asked to define nuclear, because it's very useful to have the flexibility to define it themselves. And in fact, what ultimately will be a nuclear sanction will be a function of what sanctions relief P5+1 negotiators need to offer in order to get reasonably offer in order to get what they want to see when it comes to nuclear concessions on the part of Iran.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Very quickly, just I don't think 2010 is really the cutoff for the way the Iranians are looking at this, because if you examine what has been so powerful about these sanctions, it really began in 2006 with the designation of Bank Sadarat and the continued designation of individual banks under both 13382 and
13224.
The two executive orders that were passed, the second of which we haven't talked about is explicitly related to terrorism and wasn't, in fact, crafted with the Iranians in mind at all, but it's been quite powerful in terms of cutting off Iran's individual financial institutions from the international financial system. And I think from the Iranian perspective, what they're looking for is their banks to be able to do business with the world. And obviously it's not going to happen all at once, but I don't think that any scenario in which their banks are remain under some sort of indefinite suspension from interaction with the rest of the international financial system will be acceptable to them. I will add, though, that I was surprised at what they accepted back in November. By my standards, I think they sold relatively cheap. Perhaps they thought that this sort of crack of the sanctions relief that was offered under the interim accord and the Rouhani effect and the improvements he was making at home in the economy and the putting in place of a bunch of technocrats who were out selling new contract models for the energy sector would just lure investment back, and that companies would wink and nod, as they did to a certain extent back in the late 1990s. They had to take the risk that an administration might actually decide to impose ILSA. And so I think that, it's unclear, what they would accept. What my definition of what would be a reasonable deal from the Iranian side, they may actually sell cheap once again. It depends, I think, on your definition of just how eager they are for a deal, just what the political conditions within Iran at this stage might be. My own calculation all along has been the fact that they signed on to the interim deal meant they were in for the full bargain because they got so little. And because effectively the regime, not just Rouhani, not just Zarif, but the regime itself has banked its credibility on this deal. Khamenei continues to distance himself, as we know, in his speech yesterday, and suggests some very high standards for what would be acceptable. But ultimately, if they have to walk away from this entire year of diplomacy with nothing other than this 6-month sanctions relief, the Rouhani presidency is torpedoed. And we know from historical experience that Khamenei does not like to see that level of discord within the system itself.
Well, it's interesting. Khamenei's speech yesterday, he also talked about how he supported the negotiating team. And so you get this mixed message. He's both good cop, bad cop, and he's going to have it both ways. And that's the way he's always played everything. But for those of you who don't know, remember the details of the interim deal, they took $4.2 billion of cash with another $2 or $3 billion in sales and things they could do. But it was $4.2 billion of their money that was been trapped in foreign banks. It's their oil revenue. And that's 4.2 of 100 billion that they have trapped in foreign banks. And so in some, you have to wonder if they would be satisfied in that opening stage just to get their own money back. Not to even worry about getting, the French companies or whatever that in that opening stage or that opening year or two, that they get their 100 billion back. That's a lot of money. And that takes them a long way in digging them out of the hole that, President Rouhani said shortly after he took office in a speech to the nation that the country's coffers were empty. I mean, it was an unbelievably candid moment when they had not gotten the interim deal to make that statement. And the striking thing about being in Iran these last two times was how the public really accepts the fact that it's kind of a done deal, even though it's not a done deal, that the country is going to make that, and that the supreme leader is not ignorant of public sentiment. He saw that in the polls, and I think there is a sense that, well, they were ready to move on with it, and I think their only disappointment is that it hasn't moved faster. And so to delay the process would be, I think, a stunning development, not just a political setback for Rouhani, which it would be, and it would really torpedo, as Suzanne rightly said, the kind of, not just his administration, but the kind of the hopes of anything else happening domestically, anything. Because if you can't get this, he has no leverage. He looks like a failed president. So anyway, more of your questions? In the back? Yes.
Thank you. Leandra Bernstein, Ria Novosti. I'd just like to ask for the panel's remarks on the Iranian and Russian relationship, which a lot of people have described as very positive, in particular the work Russia has done on Iran's civilian nuclear program, but how you see the Russian-Iranian relationship in the context of this upcoming agreement, and whether the strains between US and Russia could somehow play out to affect that.
Who would like to take that?
Start.
Okay.
If you've heard people describe the Iranian-Russian relationship as a positive one, you probably haven't been talking to any Iranians. Iranians have historical suspicions, well ingrained, about Russian intentions, and this dates back well before the regime, well before the century. And they have been entrenched and exacerbated by what they see as, what Iranians at least see as duplicitous Russian behavior in the course of this nuclear issue. The Russians have incredibly slow-rolled the development of Ploughshares, while of course being very prepared to take Iranian cash. And the Russians have supported and gone beyond their obligations under the UN Security Council resolutions that have led to this multilateral sanctions regime that is so powerful. So I don't think any Iranians trust the Russians any further than they can throw them. They see the Russians occasionally as a useful tool in trying to split the unity of the P5+1. That unity is really unprecedented. For most of our 35-year experience in trying to sanction Iran, we had little to no international support whatsoever, and that included the most severe moments of the hostage crisis and other moments under which you might have expected to see ready European support. So the Russians can prove a useful wedge, and I think some of these very public discussions about massive oil deals and things with the Russians are intended to do just that. Clearly, the Russians also recognize that Iran is an issue of considerable significance to the Obama administration, and it is a way to at least signal that there can be costs associated with American actions toward Moscow in response to other crises. So I think that both sides have a kind of utilitarian perspective on how to use this, but I see very little likelihood that anyone in Tehran is looking toward Moscow as their economic savior. They recognize, and I think the very basis for this deal has been, or for these negotiations has been, a recognition that they need the international financial community. They need, in particular, Europe, and hopefully someday as well the United States to do business with. They can't simply turn eastward, and they certainly can't rely on Russia.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I'll just add, as you mentioned, many people have looked at the news of a potential Russian-Iranian oil deal for 500,000 barrels per day, which is, of course, an extraordinary amount of oil, given that, A, that's 50% of what Iran exports now, and B, Russia has absolutely no need for oil because it is a major global producer itself. So that deal, it appears to be, there appears to be truth to that, some truth to that. So it then looks as though it's a kind of oil money laundering deal. I've heard various theories about why this should be going on. Apparently Russia has overcommitted its oil sales and needs to drum up some additional oil to deliver to customers. In any case, the US officials at the highest level have come out and said this cannot happen under, it would be a violation of sanctions. It cannot happen now. It cannot happen and violate, it would be an act of bad faith and violate our sanctions. And it looks as though Russia has backed off from this deal. So let that be a lesson to us in where Russia sees certain strategic advantages in the current context and who its closest friends are when it comes to moving forward with this deal in these terms and this particular set of strategic calculations.
Great.
I would just offer a little counterpoint. Russia and Iran are cooperating pretty closely in Syria to keep Assad in there. And now there's cooperation on Iraq as well. Russia has delivered Sukhois. Iran is returning the jets that Saddam flew to Iran at the start of Desert Storm. So could be a little bit of a turn from some of this mistrust, maybe.
Almost a quarter century ago. Let me take a couple of questions right here, and woman right there.
Hi, Ben Gross, globalsolutions.org. My question is that I know, like the potential, like if we can reach a deal, what kind of effects that could have in the coming years. I know that you said it might take a while to implement, but in the coming years, like the next 3 to 5 years, would there be any effects that we could easily see? And then second of all, what effect would reaching this kind of deal have on the average Iranian? Do you think that this would make a big difference in terms of how they view America or their willingness to kind of support us?
And just separately, Martha Marazza from Crisis Action, could you elaborate more on how any easing of sanctions would affect Iranian policy towards Syria and Iraq?
So I could start with that first one. The effects of a deal. So it depends, the sanctions relief that we see depends on, under a potential deal scenario, depends on the concessions that Iran is willing to make, and the pace will be matched as well. I think that in order to, all sides will want to see a substantially enough move early enough in the process under a potential nuclear agreement such that there's real incentive to stay committed and to move towards greater incentives further on. So that means that the first tranche of sanctions relief won't be tiny. It will have to be substantial enough to create enough public support for this process and moving forward towards further sanctions relief in the future. It's really impossible to put a number on what that will be because we don't know what the provisions will be, nor do we know how international companies will fare as they try and navigate all those speed bumps that I talked about, those challenges for engaging. It's sort of like an FCPA nightmare to try and do business there. Not that U.S. companies subject to such restrictions will be the first movers, but I don't want to underestimate those challenges even while it's an attractive environment. As far as how Iranians will see a deal, I think if there is some substantial amount of initial relief, and so that could look like a greater ability to sell, to export its reserves, export oil, part of its current production capacity, so not to expand oil field production capacity, but just to export more, get back to its 2.5, 2.6 levels that it was exporting at before the toughest round of most recent sanctions, plus the ability to repatriate that revenue and move it around the international system more easily, even if not unlocking $100 billion. That would be favorable. That would be a very favorable outcome, and that will have an impact for, I think it will have a positive impact in public sentiment in Iran. People there, I think, when it's difficult to move around money, like an inheritance or something from within Iran to family members outside, even those transactions are very difficult. You can buy a fancy car in Iran, but you really have difficulty sending money, or humanitarian transactions, things that have been exempted from U.S. sanctions and are not subject to sanctions. If those kinds of transactions become easier as part of sanctions relief, I think there will be a real positive sentiment that will be appreciated by the Iranian people and more broadly.
The second question?
Just, as I said before, the financial requirements for what Iran's activities on Iraq and Syria are quite substantial. They have to give Hezbollah more money to fight on behalf of Assad. They are paying the Iraqi Shiite groups more money to get in the game against ISIS in Iraq. They had integrated these Iraqi jets into their air force. They are now drawing those down and giving them to Mr. Maliki. They've lost an Iranian pilot. They are losing men in Syria, and now they've lost some in Iraq. And each time somebody gets killed, they have to pay widows' benefits and orphans' benefits. And Hezbollah, they fund Hezbollah, who has lost a lot of men, and Iran ultimately funds those widows' payments. So, this adds up. It's not all cash transactions, obviously, that they need dollars or euros or yen or something, but it's a drain. So I think a deal would help them on these issues.
I actually think that ISIS may be the kind of dark horse factor in these negotiations. That the one thing that I heard over and over and over from Iran is how they're afraid of what's the kind of Salafi circle surrounding Iran now that's no longer the Shiite crescent. Right. And it's whether it's the potential return of the Taliban in Afghanistan, the rise of ISIS and other extremist groups. It's the Wahhabi movements, the Salafi movements in Central Asia that on every border they feel increasingly vulnerable, ironically in part because of the U.S. withdrawal. And they think, when I even went to see the ringleader of the takeover of the U.S. Embassy in 1979, and he talked about how he spent all of his time as a young activist trying to end U.S. influence and manipulation of Iran, and how today he's spending all of his energy devoted to trying to get the two sides together again because they have this common threat from extremists. And it was, a lightning bolt. So I think that one of the things that's kind of looming over these talks is they actually have a common security concern in the region. And that the closer every ISIS development begins to kind of add to the sense of what are the threats. They had developed a nuclear program, in part we think because of Saddam. Well, no nuclear stuff isn't going to work against ISIS. This is the security threat has changed as well. Let me take two. Yeah, sure.
I think that actually it creates multivalent pressures on the negotiations, and I think the confluence of this crisis at this crunch time for the negotiations is going to be A, fascinating, and B, very precipitous. Because I think, if I'm an Iranian hardliner and watching what's happening around the region, the last thing I want to do right now is engage in a major concession on a major security, an existential security program to the United States. Certainly, many of the reformist activists who were involved with the embassy seizure in '79 have come a very long distance from their perspective on Washington, but the hardliners have not. And what they see, I think, is much an argument for a greater defense, a more aggressive offense in the region, and for a stiffer spine toward the international community, and real concern about appearing to capitulate at a time when there's regional weakness. And that's the sort of mentality that characterizes many of those in the security establishment. I think you heard Khamenei speaking to some of that yesterday in his talk. So I'm less persuaded. I think they'll also look at the oil markets and wonder if, in fact, the possibility, certainly not the probability or the inevitability, but the possibility that Iraqi oil exports could be impacted by what's happening might be a new opening for sanctions busting on their part without actually having to do a deal. So I'm worried about, the countervailing tendencies and the way that it impacts the Iranian negotiators. But I just wanted to say, in terms of what we can expect to see, to the questions that were posed, how we could expect relief to go if there is actually a deal. Look back in history. Look back to the Iranian decision in 1988, really
Yes.
that predated the ceasefire, the decision that Iran needed to re-engage with the world. And it took quite a number of years before we saw the fruits of that begin to pay off, because there were so many internal contests about how to go about that, and because internationally the fact that Iran hadn't really changed its foreign policy, or at least not its regional policy, meant that Iran was still subject to reversal. Those openings were still subject to reversal. So if in 1988 Iran decided that it was time to lure international companies into its oil sector, it wasn't until 1995 that we saw the first really big upstream contract offered to Conoco, and then of course precipitated the US sanctions. That was in part because when it was offered to an Italian and Japanese consortium a few years earlier, the export financing was pulled because of concerns about Iran's domestic economic stability and because of issues of Iran's involvement with terrorism. And so I think that we're likely to see a similar process, and as we said, far worse, because now you've got to add on to that the layers of complexity of removing or relaxing or waiving or licensing, and the bureaucracy and the legal procedures involved.
Can I add one?
Sure.
Just, I think I would be remiss if I didn't add this regarding oil company interest. So when you see international oil companies that feel comfortable managing challenges and risks in Iraq, for example, or Nigeria or Russia, it's clear that international oil companies, they need opportunities, major field opportunities, in order to perform well economically or commercially. And Iran, even with tremendous risks that exist in doing business there, is absolutely right there on the table, looks attractive if there's enough relief to go in there. By comparison to Arctic or ultra-deep drilling, Iran, I think, presents a risk that oil companies would want to get their arms around, at least in an initial bid or lease sale process. So it may be slow, it may be tough going, but if they feel comfortable in Iraq and Nigeria, they will feel comfortable in Iran.
A Western diplomat I saw in Tehran said to me, Iran's the last gold mine on earth,
Right.
and everyone wants to get back here. And it's very true. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I would love to have taken other questions, but please join me in thanking Suzanne, Ken, and Liz. You've all learned this morning how difficult this is going to be, even for us, to work a deal. I hope you will join us if we get a deal, because we plan to continue our series in informing people on what a deal means, what's next, the implications, and all the other things that will come with it. So thanks again.